When Clint Eastwood walked past an art stand on a busy city sidewalk, most people didn't even notice him, just another face in the crowd. But when he stopped and picked up a painting, everything changed. This wasn't just any artist. Sophie Carter was fighting for more than recognition. She was painting to save her life. Sophie sat in a sterile, dimly lit hospital room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses and delivered the news Sophie had feared. The treatment was working, but she needed 2 more rounds of chemo. She knew the next part was coming. Without insurance, the costs would be substantial. Her mother's breath hitched beside her as she fought back tears, knowing their savings were gone. Sophie wasn't scared of dying. What terrified her was seeing her parents lose everything trying to save her. That night, Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart racing. She refused to be a burden. If she could sell her art, maybe she could pay for her treatment. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. By morning, she had made up her mind. She would fight back with her art. The first stroke of paint felt like magic. Sophie set up an art stand on a downtown sidewalk. Each canvas represented her soul, her only weapon against the illness that threatened to take everything from her. Her mother helped set up the booth, but the rest was up to Sophie. She poured everything into her work, knowing that every sale could be a step toward saving her life. But the reality was harsh. People passed by, barely noticing her. A few glanced at her sign. Original art funding, my cancer treatment. But few stopped. Sophie gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. The heat pressed down, making her dizzy. She had sold nothing. After hours of trying, an elderly couple finally stopped. They admired her painting, a desert sky painted in deep purples and golds. They bought it for $80. Sophie packed the painting into a bag, overwhelmed by the feeling of victory. It was her first sale, her first real hope. Though she only sold 1 painting, Sophie refused to give up. She watched the people move around her, tourists, businessmen, musicians, all wrapped up in their own worlds. She sat, fighting the exhaustion that crept in. A woman in a floral dress stopped and sympathized, offering pity rather than support. Sophie smiled politely, hearing the word brave again. She wasn't brave, she was desperate. Then a man in a leather jacket approached. "Nobody buys real art anymore," he scoffed. Sophie bit back the urge to argue. She wasn't looking for advice. She just needed to fight. By the 4th day, Sophie was exhausted. The summer heat weighed heavily on her, and she had only sold 3 paintings. It wasn't enough. Just as she began to doubt, a young journalist stopped at her stand. She took photos of Sophie's work and asked her story. Sophie shared about her diagnosis, her medical bills, and her determination to not let her parents struggle alone. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, promising to spread the word. The next morning, something had changed. More people stopped by, and by noon, Sophie had sold more paintings than the entire previous week. Then her phone buzzed. A message from her best friend, Lucas. "Check this out." It was an article titled, "Fighting for Art, Fighting for Life, the teen who's painting her way to chemotherapy." The article had gone viral, shared thousands of times. Sophie's heart raced. She didn't know just how big this moment was about to become. In the afternoon, a quiet presence at her booth signaled that something was different. She looked up and saw a man standing still, studying her paintings. He was older, with a cowboy hat and a weathered leather jacket. Sophie felt his gaze, not like the others. He wasn't rushing or distracted. He was really seeing her work. "See anything you like?" Sophie asked, her voice hoarse from the long day. The man smirked. "Depends," he said slowly. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie hesitated. Most people asked about the price, not the story. But this man was different. She cleared her throat and told him the truth. She painted because she had to. It was the only thing she could control right now. The man didn't blink. He just waited. Sophie told him about her diagnosis, the ticking clock, and how every brushstroke was a fight for her life. He nodded slowly. "I'll take them all," he said. Clint Eastwood, legendary actor and director, had just bought every painting on her stand. Sophie's life had changed in that moment. Her fight was far from over, but with Clint Eastwood's support, Sophie knew she could keep going. This wasn't just about art anymore. It was about survival. Every sale wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back her life. Sophie had poured everything into her art, but when she finished her painting for the day, something incredible happened. A man who had been casually looking through her work lifted one of her favorite pieces, a black and white desert landscape featuring a lone cowboy against a vast sky. Sophie had spent weeks perfecting it. The man studied it carefully, then nodded. "I'll take this one," he said. Sophie blinked, surprised by the choice. "It's $200, she said, unsure of what to expect. But the man didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook and scribbled something down. He handed her the check, and Sophie stared at the number. It wasn't $200. It was $50,000. Her hands began to shake as she looked at the amount, barely able to comprehend it. She could hardly breathe. This can't be right," she whispered. The man, revealing himself as Clint Eastwood, smirked. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a damn good painting." Sophie felt the world shift beneath her. She had spent her childhood watching Clint Eastwood movies with her father, and now here he was, changing her life in the middle of a busy street. "Why are you doing this?" Sophie asked, but words failed her as she processed what had just happened. Clint simply nodded, his eyes calm. "Just keep painting, kid," he said. A few onlookers had started to take notice. A teenage boy stopped, staring in disbelief. Then the whispers spread. People began to crowd around, realizing that Clint Eastwood was standing in front of Sophie's booth, buying her paintings. Phones were pulled out, pictures were snapped, and soon a frenzy of people swarmed Sophie's stand. What had been a quiet booth became the hottest attraction in the city. One by one, the paintings that had been ignored for days were being sold, without a second thought or a haggled price. Clint stood off to the side, calm and unbothered, as the crowd grew more excited. "Just keep painting," he said again, tipping his hat and walking away. By the time Sophie got home that night, her phone was flooded with messages and notifications. Headlines exploded across the internet. Clint Eastwood buys teens painting for $50,000 and Hollywood legend helps young artist battling cancer. Sophie could hardly believe what she was reading. She was everywhere, on news sites, Twitter, Instagram. Videos of Clint handing her the check had millions of views. Her best friend Lucas called, "Sophie, you are literally everywhere." Messages flooded in from strangers, buyers, and even people from all over the world who wanted to buy her art. Some even offered commissions, others praised her strength and courage. Sophie's inbox filled up with requests for interviews, donations, and more. The most surprising message came from a prestigious gallery in New York, offering to represent her in an upcoming exhibition. Sophie couldn't process everything fast enough. She wasn't just selling paintings anymore, she had become a symbol of resilience. A month later, Sophie walked into the hospital for her final round of treatment, paid in full. Every bill was covered, and the crushing financial burden that had once seemed insurmountable was gone. The chemo was tough, but this time Sophie wasn't scared. She had a future outside that hospital room, and it was brighter than she could have imagined. A week after her final treatment, Sophie received a letter from Clint Eastwood. She opened it carefully, tears welling up in her eyes as she read, "Your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Clint." Sophie folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest. That night, she picked up a brush and began to paint again. Her first official gallery show was coming up, and her career was just beginning. But there was one painting Sophie would never sell, the first one she had ever sold, the black and white Western landscape. It now hung in Clint Eastwood's private collection, a reminder that true grit isn't just in Westerns,